I am thrilled today to be joined by Professor Nelson Repenning and Don Kieffer. Don is a senior lecturer in operations management at the Sloan School and has a long and distinguished career as a practitioner of the arts of operations management and has joined us in more academic pursuits more recently. Nelson is a prolific contributor to executive education over the years, but more importantly for today's purposes, also has done a lot of groundbreaking research on various aspects of organizations and operations, and also serves as the faculty director of the MIT Leadership Center. So thank you, Nelson and Don, for joining us today. This is really a pleasure and a privilege to have two people to come and talk about a project which we can already see is really having a dramatic impact in the world of business and management, and that is your recently published book, which I'm sure you're going to tell us a little bit more about in the coming minutes. The format here, everyone, just to remind you, is that we do want this to be interactive. So Don and Nelson will speak for a little while to introduce their ideas and their material, but what they're really looking forward to is hearing your questions, which I will help to facilitate a little later in the session. So as Charlotte mentioned, please do put your questions in the Q&A so that I can sort through them and help Nelson and Don review those. But also feel free to throw any comments or ideas that you have in the chat as this goes along so that we can keep it as interactive as possible. And we'll keep an eye on that too. So with that, let's move on to the event itself. We're going to cover best practices. We're going to learn about what dynamic work design is, and I'm sure that Don and Nelson will explain that to us. And in particular, the so what. What does this enable organizations to achieve that they haven't been able to achieve in the past? And before handing over to Nelson, I can't also resist reminding you both that now many years ago, you came to my office and said, Peter, we think we've got a way to teach people about the things that that most organizations get wrong when they're trying to implement particularly improvement programs and change that are around different kinds of improvement programs. And from that, we started an executive education course that Nelson and Don have taught with great success. They've taught this material to executive MBAs and many other people around the world as well. So I feel like I was there at the beginning. So I'm super excited, Nelson and Don, to really get this update from you and to hand over to you. And I will go on mute and come back and help with the Q&A a little bit later.
Thank you, Peter, and welcome everyone.
Yeah, welcome, Peter. Thank you. And you're exactly right. You and your exec ed colleagues, I think, played a really critical role in helping us move forward with this, which we appreciate. So welcome, everybody. It's great to see you all, at least virtually speaking. So I'm Nelson Repenning. Don and I have a new book out. It's called There's Got to Be a Better Way, which we're going to try to give you a little bit of an overview about today. And depending on how you look at it, this has been either 5 or more than 30 years in the making. Don will introduce himself in a moment, but probably the gist of our tag team is I am very much an academic. I'm an MIT lifer. I've been here essentially my whole adult life, and Don has had a 40-year industry career. And so what we hope happens here is this is sort of in the best tradition of MIT, hand in mind coming together and creating a framework for helping you think about what happens in your organization. And I'll talk a little bit. Don's going to jump in a few times, and we're going to try to save quite a bit of time for questions, so you can give us, tell us what you want to hear. What I thought I would start with here today, just to motivate this, is the book is very story-driven. Don and I, over the course of our now almost 30-year collaboration, have worked in a lot of different organizations trying to help them make their work better. And the book covers a couple dozen different examples. But there's one in particular that I think is a very simple intervention that if you understand how this works, and we'll loop back to this at the end, I think really captures a lot of the essence of what we are trying to do in terms of making knowledge work better. So the company here is Standard Chartered Bank. If you're from the US, you may not have heard of them, but they are a very large bank, do lots of business in the Middle East and Africa. And at the time, the chief operating officer was a good friend of ours, David Whiting. Um, and the problem that he was tasked with was, as the chief operating officer, excuse me, his office was responsible for one phase of their IT development process. So every time they would develop a new project, whether it was an app or a change to the larger infrastructure, his office would have to do what was called the approval step. And essentially what that meant is they had 16 risk experts, and those risk experts were responsible for evaluating the projects to make sure that they had, appropriate security and safety and consistent with their customer outlook and so on and so forth. When David showed up at the outset, the average time for just this part of the IT development process, not the actual technology development, was over 120 days. And so that meant getting these approvals done through these 16 risk officers took them, 4 months in most cases to get it completed. Big source of frustration for the organization. And David did a little sort of investigating here because this just didn't seem like that much time was required to do the particular part. And his big insight, which we'll come back to later, was he said, I realized the process was gated by the risk manager who thought the project was the least important. And essentially what I want you to imagine here is that you're the project manager that has to get your project through this approvals process. And you essentially have 16 people who you need to chase via Slack or email to try to set up meetings to give them attention to your particular project. This could be an exceedingly slow and frustrating process. So David made a very simple intervention. He created a one meeting a week that was an hour long. And that meeting was guided by what he called a common backlog, which was nothing more than essentially a flip chart that had a list of all the projects that they needed to approve. And they were rank ordered. So this is the most important, second most important, and so on. And then the goal of the meeting, just for an hour a week with all the 16 risk experts in the room, is they would work on the project on the top of the list until either it was done or they came across information that was needed, in which case someone would be assigned to go get that. And then once a project was done, they'd go on to the next one. Right? Couldn't be simpler. But you can see here the average results were pretty stunning. That 120 days was reduced to 20. And by Standard Charter's own internal metrics, because they were getting their projects to the market sooner, they saved themselves annually $250 million. Okay? Now, this is a cherry-picked example in the sense that I tried to pick the sort of simplest one, and it has some pretty stunning results here. But there's two things I want to say about this, which is number one, it is my contention through years of research that if you want a truly great organization, it is not built out of t-shirts and coffee mugs and change initiatives and so on and so forth. It is built on an uncountable number of small projects that look like this one, fixing small projects in your organization, small problems in your organization to make things work better. And the second thing I would say is I am very confident that projects like this and opportunities like this exist in all of your organizations. Right? I haven't visited your companies in most cases, and you're probably thinking, how can that be the case? I can only say that Don and I have worked with enough companies over the course of our careers and found opportunities like this in all of them. And so what that means is hopefully by thinking a little bit differently, there are some really big wins for all of you in terms of making your organizations work better. And what the book is really about is how to go get those. And what we want to do in the remainder of the talk is give you just a little sense of what those look like, and then we'd be happy to take your questions. So how did we get here? I'll give you my version first. As I said, I've been at MIT essentially my whole adult life, and I've really only worked as an academic on one question, which basically boils down to why don't organizations use all the tools and processes that we agree are good things to do? And I've worked on this in the safety environment. I've worked on this in R&D, worked on it in healthcare and a bunch of other options. And the bottom line here is it turns out, and the evidence here is pretty clear, is that most organizations know far more than they do. And so what really kind of attracted me to this field was trying to answer this question of there are all these good tools and processes out there, and yet people tend not to use them on a regular basis. And so that really was my entry point, and that's about the time that I met Don, and I'll give him a few minutes to talk about sort of his, he came in here from a slightly different angle, and I think that's from where dynamic work design was born. So Don, let me turn it over to you for a sec.
Yeah. The first question, the single question that really got me started came from my boss. And he said, Don, we love the results you're getting, but how the hell are you getting them? You've got everyone confused with you're talking differently. You ask about different questions about different data. No one can figure out what you're doing or what you want them to do. So you need to sit down and explain it to us. And I think that was hard because I actually had learned to work partly from my own experience. I was a problem solver. I started in industry running machinery, metal cutting machinery when I was 17, and ended up as an electrical engineer, and then got into management. And so I was solving big problems. I solved my way up to a bigger job. But I'd learned a lot from a guy from Toyota and some other people, and I was pretty effective at putting points on the board. But trying to describe it was pretty confounding. I came up with 10 ideas, which I sat down with each of my 28 executive colleagues and explained, and that was pretty good. But when I showed those 10 ideas to Nelson, he goes like, well, Don, these are pretty good. And he sort of chuckled, being the academic he was. These aren't really principles, Don. Good try. And that really started our collaboration at trying to discover through practice, through more experimentation, what are kind of the underlying features of how we design work for human beings. And it took us a lot of time to get them figured out and condensed down to 5. But that was the start for me. As the results are great, Don, but how the hell are you getting them? And then trying to write it down.
Great. So let me give you the big idea that goes with this, and then we'll talk about some of those principles. But I would say, as a sort of preamble to this, is that at least for me, and I think for Don too, we have seen the pieces of this puzzle long before the picture really gelled together. And I think in part writing the book has helped us get a lot clearer on what we're talking about. So we could help students and clients make the organization work better, but really trying to explain it to a student so they could go do it themselves, that was a whole other problem, which we have spent quite a bit of time working on, and hopefully we've made some progress on that. So here's the big idea that drives all of this. Most formal organizational processes, so think about your budget processes, your strategy processes, your HR processes, the big things that define your organizations, are based on the largely implicit belief that we can predict the future and we can predict our impact on it, right? So if you think about the budgeting process or the strategy process in your organization, implied by both the strategies you sign up for and the budgets that you agree to hit is some forecast of what's going to happen in the next 6 months or 12 months or whatever might be the case, right? So to use the jargon that we use in the ivory tower where I live, right, we're assuming that the world is essentially static, right? It's not going to change in any material way over the planning period. Okay? Now, of course, we all know that that's not true, right? Every business article for a practitioner starts out with the line, "The world is changing faster than ever before." Now, I don't know whether that's true. The world probably felt like it was changing pretty fast 100 years ago. But nonetheless, every senior leader and manager is facing lots of change along the time. So we know that that world is not that static place that we presume it is when we're going through all our planning activities. And so what happens is inevitably, when you make that budget or you make that strategy or you make that plan, sooner or later, the world is going to change. And the implicit forecast of the future is not going to be an accurate guide to what's actually happening. Okay? So the formal processes that you face in your organization are now going to break down. Okay? And then what happens, of course, is because your organizations are staffed by smart, talented, motivated people who want to move up, what do? They work around them. And that is where the trouble starts. Right? And to see this as a simple example, one of the exercises that Don and I like to do in class all the time is we ask our students, how long in your companies is budget season? Meaning from the day the budget goes in effect, how much time prior to that do you start planning? And the average time for most of our students, and it varies a little bit depending on the size of the organization, is about 6 months, right? So if your budget goes in effect in January, somewhere around July and August, you're going to start the back and forth and trading spreadsheets and so on and so forth. Then the second question I always ask is, and then once the budget goes in effect, how long are the assumptions in it relevant enough that it's a good guide for action? And the average answer there tends to be around 3 months, right? So that kind of captures the dilemma right there, right? Which is we're spending twice as long creating this budget as we are actually using it. But then where the trouble starts is what do we do for the other 9 months of the year? Well, I agreed to this strategy in this budget, which is no longer an accurate depiction of what's happening in the world. So what do? I get out my duct tape and my safety pins and my chewing gum, and I make it look like I'm following that budget when in fact I'm not, right? And Don and I use the term workaround as kind of a generic description of all the little changes people make to make it seem like they're following the process when they're not. And that is where the trouble starts. If you want to see an example of what these workarounds look like, you can see a clip up top from the very famous episode of I Love Lucy, where Lucy and Ethel are working at the chocolate factory. If you've never watched it before, just go to your favorite browser and type Lucy Chocolate Factory episode. And there is a fabulous example of what happens of, when they start working too quickly and they have to work around the process. But then the other thing that happens, and the reason these workarounds are so problematic, is captured in my little graph on the bottom, which is in most cases what the workaround does is it solves the problem in the short run, but it actually erodes the capability and creates bigger problems in the long run. Any of you that are familiar with some of my earlier work, this is the firefighting or the capability trap in action. And essentially what's happening is that all these little changes that people are making do not add up to the results that people want, right? And so the essence of why organizations struggle to do new things, why they become sort of so hardened in their arteries, is that the formal processes are mismatched with what's happening in the world, and then people are working below the waterline to fix that, but all those fixes do not add up to the results the organization wants. And the essence of dynamic work design is if we can take all those little changes that people are making privately and bring some of that above the waterline so they're made publicly, there is a huge amount of energy and expertise in the folks that do the work that we can leverage, often to make the work a lot better. Okay? So how do we do that? Well, in the book, we define 5 principles for dynamic work design. And dynamic work design is really 2 things. There is both a set of principles, which I'll describe quickly, and then there's the approach to use them, which Don will speak about in just a second. I'm going to go through these quickly, and again, I'm happy to dig into these in the Q&A in a moment. But the 5 sort of big ideas are here. Number 1, if you believe that we live in a dynamic world and organizations need to adapt regularly, then problem solving becomes the engine of productive dynamism. And so our first principle is you need to get people engaged in solving the right problem and actually in solving the problem right. This is just essentially a charge to get people to use some of the structured problem-solving methods that they already know, to make sure that when we solve a problem, we actually solve it correctly and that we are capturing any of the new knowledge that might be generated. And so again, essentially the idea here is to move a lot of those workarounds from things that are private to public problem-solving projects so that we know that there's a change and we can take advantage from any benefits that it might produce. Second principle we call structure for discovery. And the basic idea here is simply to make sure that people are learning the right lessons from their day-to-day work. I won't drag you through all the psychology, at least for the moment, but it is very clear that when people do work on a day-to-day basis, they are constantly learning, right? They essentially have a sort of large language model in their heads. And it turns out that most work is so poorly structured that they often learn lessons that are totally contrary to the goal of the organization. And so just spending a little time making sure that people are learning the right lessons by clear targets and clear activities and a few other elements often can lead to significant gains. Okay? Third principle is what we call connect the human chain. If you take the first 2 seriously, it means that we are hopefully seeing problems quickly and we're solving them effectively. The third principle says, let's make sure that we escalate those problems to the person or the group of people that is in the best position to solve it. A classic example of a well-connected human chain that many of you are probably familiar with is just the andon cord that Toyota has on its production line. I see a problem, I pull the cord, and the right person comes to help me pretty quickly. Knowledge work often lacks anything remotely resembling that kind of clarity. And when a knowledge worker comes across a problem, they often have little or no idea to whom they should escalate it to get help. We have found that just wiring together the organization in simple ways so problems get to the right places can lead to some very big gains. Fourth principle is what we call regulate the flow. Any of you that have seen me talk in past versions of these webinars will know I've spent a good chunk of my career talking about how overloading organizations is a express lane to firefighting. The regulate the flow principle is all about how do we make sure that we put the right amount of work in the system so that we can both see problems, but we actually have time to solve them and invest in capability. And then the final principle, which is in some sense the glue that holds all the rest of this together, is what we call visualize the work. And the essence of this one is an insight that Don and I had earlier in our work together, which is if you think about it for a moment, and I see that people are putting words like Kaizen in the chat, is that most of the major innovations in work design have come in the world of physical work and actually mostly in factories and manufacturing assembly. And it turns out there's a good reason for that, which is physical work tends to give you pretty clear signals when something went wrong. So when Dom was managing a plant at Harley-Davidson, if the assembly line broke, it was moving, something went wrong, it is now stopped, gives you a clear signal that that work is stopped. Hey, maybe we should go see what's going on and fix it. Knowledge work tends not to give us signals, particularly in the short run when stuff goes wrong. An engineer could come across a problem that he or she can't solve. When's his or her boss going to find about it? No idea. Could be later, could be next week. Any of you that have experience in R&D will know sometimes major defects are surfaced weeks or months after they're discovered because people have been actively hiding those problems. Okay? The idea behind visualize the work is simply if we can take that knowledge work, which is hidden in your email inboxes and your Microsoft project files, give it some kind of visual representation so that we can see whether it's moving or not moving, we can often make the work far more effectively pretty quickly. And there's a bunch of different techniques for doing this, ranging from Post-its to sophisticated IT systems. But the core idea is simply to create some kind of radar screen where we can see how the work is moving through the system so that we can allocate our attention appropriately. So let me turn over to Don for a second. So that's kind of the ideas that underlie this, but there's also an approach that has worked best for us in terms of putting this into action in the organizations that we've worked with.
Before I speak about the approach, I just have to comment on two things in the chat I saw. One is I love the word fudget instead of budget, which is, I think that's great. I wish I had known that a long time ago. I'm going to steal that one. The other is a question right below, which is, does this mean building in time for meaningful reflection? I think in all of these principles and the method, you're going to see ingrained and woven throughout is the idea of discovering the next best way. So reflection is a huge part of this, is what did we learn? Did something? Did it have the effect we wanted? If so, how can we expand it? If not, what can we learn? So this meaningful reflection is part of the, if people know PDCA, Plan, Do, Check, Act, it doesn't mean please don't change anything, Plan, Do, Check, Act, that it's built in, that reflection is built in everything we do. Everything is termed as an experiment. And I think in terms of, if you take the visualize the work principle and the structure for discovery, that's kind of the essence of what we're doing, is making everything an experiment we can learn from. And to do that, our approach is to always start small. So we take a small piece of an important problem. Nelson calls this the anti-initiative many times. He calls it that in the book, is that we don't put a lot of stock in these big programs, top-down programs, big change programs. What we do is take a small part of an important problem and go find out what's really happening, experiment, put some points on the board, take what you learn, and then take it to scale. And we think the method really is, instead of looking at the static structures like the reports that we get that are a month late or a week late or 6 months late or a quarter late, it's all just data. Let's go actually watch the work. So we view the organization differently than most. We view the organization as a 10, 100, 10,000, or tens of thousands of people all wired together in a very complex way to get work to the customer, from an idea to a product. And what we do is we take one piece of work and follow it through that web of individual people and watch the work as it's happening. And this helps us really separate what we think is going to happen, or what is supposed to happen, from what's really happening, and see all those workarounds and see all those gaps, and then we fix those. And that tends to get us a 30% improvement really fast if we pick the problem correctly. But picking a part of important problem is really the key because we want to move the numbers in the business. So we run experiments and we take it to scale. And what we learned from doing this is not only a great way to solve small problems and put points on the board, it really opens the door towards a larger change and expanding what you learned. And even beyond that, that culture of experimentation and discovery leads to an operating system. And that's really what these 5 principles in the approach is. It's a whole operating system based on discovering the next best way in real time, not waiting for the big crisis, not waiting for the next book and concept to come your way, but we're going to discover it through pushing on our own work, finding the gaps and problems. And those problems to us are just a little crack in the wall where light's coming through. We're like, hey, there's opportunity here. Let's go figure out what's going on. So the approach is the method, and the principles are the way we think about the work when we see it. It's not based on which department's doing what. It's not based on people's personal skill. It's based on actually the design of the work as it flows through the system.
All right, great. So I will move forward, and I want to give you one sort of very practical insight to take with you. But I'm noticing in the chat, a lot of you are saying, well, this looks similar to Agile or DMAIC, or I see a bunch of other things. And you are exactly right. And I think the best way to explain that and what we think is new here is Don and I purposely chose the word principles here very carefully. And there's a reason for that. And the reason is the following, which is those of you that have been in the management world for a long period of time will know that particularly for the practitioner side of the literature, there's always been an obsession with best practices, right? So we're going to look at what Toyota does or what Google does or what Facebook does. I'm not sure what is the hot company right now. And whatever they do, their practices, we're going to do that in our organization. And there is a massive multi-billion-dollar industry in trying to transfer practices from one place to another. The only problem with that is it actually doesn't really work. I'll give you a very concrete example. I've spent quite a bit of time in the energy industry, and it turns out that much of the U.S. oil and gas industry is all on one freeway in Houston, Texas, and literally all the big companies are in this one stretch of road. But when they try to move a practice that works in one company literally across the street, right, it often doesn't work because even though they may be US-based companies, they're in the same industry, they hire from the same schools, and they get the same people, their cultures are nonetheless different. And the way that they have assembled all the workarounds to create working processes is also different. And so plopping a practice that worked on the one side of the street down on the others does not work because you have to make adjustments to make sure that it fits the way the work is done locally. The reason we call them principles is we want you to know why these work so that when you have to take one of these ideas and adjust it for your unique organization, as long as you respect the underlying principle, you're probably going to be okay, right? And Don had a great example from early in his career when Harley first adopted some of the practices associated with, Toyota and Japanese style manufacturing. One of the things they did is they changed all the Japanese words to plain spoken American words, which for their unionized workforce at the time was a really good choice, right? They still respected the underlying efficacy of the principle, even though they had to make some adjustments to the practice. And there are many more that are more complicated, but it's very important. And we want you to understand the why behind these things so that you can use them effectively. And so we kind of joke that we think of this book sometimes as a Rosetta Stone for all the different methods that are out there to help you see why is it that DMAIC works or why is it that Agile works. So if you understand the principle, then you can adapt that to your particular environment in a way that makes sense. And that's actually probably a good segue to what I wanted to show you quickly. So let's just talk very quickly about this project I talked about in the beginning. Why does this work, right? So we have this onerous process. It takes 120 days. The project managers are chasing the risk managers. And suddenly the COO creates a 1-hour weekly meeting and you see these dramatic gains. Well, sort of what's up with that? Well, the easiest way to see that is to just, everything in the social sciences is a 2x2 matrix, is to show you this little diagram here, which is if you were to study conventional organization theory, one of the things it would tell you that is captured in this diagram is that they often will design work into 2 types. There's work that's highly precise and controlled. So think of this as like, issuing a paycheck. We do it exactly the same way every week. And then we have other types of work that's highly ambiguous. So creating a new product or treating a complicated patient case. And we should organize those two kinds of work differently, right? So if we are issuing paychecks every month, I don't need a meeting with the accounting department every 2 weeks to get my paycheck because it's the same every week. It's very standard work. We don't need a complicated transfer, right? In contrast, when Don and I are sitting down to fight over a chapter for this book, right, much better for us to do that as a group because that's highly ambiguous work and we don't know how that is supposed to work. Okay? One of the things that we have added, to this is in the Connect the Human Chain principle, we talk a lot about all real processes are a mix of pretty precise standard work and some really complicated work. And so we talk a lot in the book about how you design the work so it moves between these two boxes in a sensible way. And so we talk about handoffs and huddles and triggers and checks. And we can go into that during the Q&A if you want. But what I want to talk about here briefly, just to give you sort of one insight, is what happens when you have work that you're trying to do serially. So I'm just handing it from Don to Nelson to Peter and so on. But in fact, there's a lot of ambiguity in there. Okay? Well, the result of that is what we call ineffective iteration, right? So when we try to do ambiguous work in a serial fashion, meaning that we don't have regular face-to-face communications, what we end up with is a phenomena that I'm sure you all are very familiar with, which is we spend all day sending Slack messages and emails around as we're iterating on this particular topic, right? And that's what was going wrong at Standard Chartered Bank, right? Doing a risk analysis of a complex IT project is not something that is amenable to doing one-on-one emails back and forth. And so, of course, what they ended up with is these very long email messages that we all have in our email inboxes and endless instant messaging threads. And, these could have threads that would be a dozen or 24 messages as they go back and forth. Extremely inefficient. And so one of the things that we have discovered is that when you are in that ineffective iteration sort of syndrome, and we've all been there, substituting a well-designed face-to-face meeting, and we'll count Zoom as a face-to-face meeting in this context, can often get rid of hundreds of emails a day, because something that can take a dozen emails back and forth can often be sorted out in a 10 or 15 minute conversation. And so what happened in Standard Charter is, unbeknownst to them, they were executing a complicated work in probably the most inefficient way that you could possibly imagine by having this poor project manager have to have email threads with 16 different people, either for scheduling meetings or just trying to resolve uncertainty. Once we get all those people in the room, suddenly we can get something done in 15 minutes that might have taken weeks in order to accomplish, simply by using a face-to-face meeting for what it's good for, which is resolving uncertainty. And so if you go back to the example, you can see actually all of our principles here, which is they connected the human chain much more effectively by having everybody in the room together. They had a clear problem statement, which is our first principle, which is, let's see if we can get that first one off the list. The work was highly prioritized by the list, and that simple list helped them visualize the work that they were all trying to get done. So what I want you to take away from this is, again, this probably seems kind of amazing that a 1 hour week could generate so many gains. I'll tell you that although the magnitude may be a little bit different, you have gains like this sitting in your organization. We've seen this happen enough times that we're very confident that they're out there. And particularly if you've never worked this way before, the fruit is actually hanging pretty low. And in some cases, you may well be tripping over it, metaphorically speaking. There are a lot of options out there, or a lot of possibilities to make knowledge work better. And then the last little thing I'll say, which I think is an interesting sort of coda to this story, is that when David first started doing this, is he got a little pushback from his colleagues, like, well, having all these 16 risk managers in the meeting every week is pretty expensive. Do you think we can afford this meeting? I don't know how much money these risk analysts made, but I'm pretty sure that if you multiply by that 16, you don't get $250 million a year, right? So it's just another example of where organizations can often kind of miss the forest for the trees. So with that, we'll stop the share. Don, I don't know if you have any final remarks, and then we will open it up to questions and be happy to tackle any of the stuff that you all might want to hear from us.
I just want to add that our little saying about people who, especially our students, when we coach them they have to go do a project in their own area, and we say you have to drop down several layers below your job title and go actually look at the work. And they're like, oh, we've been there, done that. We're doing big projects now. And we tell them, well, go do it because you have to, because Nelson's the teacher and he's saying that's part of your homework. But if you're not embarrassed by what you find in your own area that you know so well, you're not really looking hard enough. And when people come back from that exercise, we hear all kinds of very humble stories of people who grew up in their business, grew up in their factory or in their IT system, wherever, and they come back and say, you can't believe what I found right under my own nose. So it's there. And I think much of what we do is connecting the management system with the actual real work that's going on, not what's supposed to be happening and not what people think is happening, and bringing the resources and the wisdom of the management together with the experience of people doing the work. And that's what really creates the good dynamic.
Yeah. All right, Peter.
Great. Well, we've definitely got some questions. Let me encourage people to keep putting questions in the Q&A. Maybe I could just start off with one while people are thinking. Early on in your presentation, you talked a couple of times, Nelson, about escalating a problem. And I think to many people that notion implies or suggests that hierarchy in some way. Is that what you mean to imply when you talk about escalation, or is there a different way we should be thinking about that?
I would say, actually, I think the hierarchy is very important. And this is Don's metaphor, but I think it really works well. If you want to see a good example of escalation, just think about how the fire alarm works in your house, right? So when my smoke detector goes off and there's a fire alarm, right, it doesn't go to a random fire department in Boston. Or if you call the fire department, if I say, hey, my stove's on fire, right, they don't immediately give me a lecture about fire prevention or ask me whether my, fire extinguishers are up to date. Instead, that fire alarm goes to the Cambridge Fire Department that's closest to where I live. And those people at the fire department know that their job is to come to my house and put out the fire. And then after the fire is put out, okay, then maybe we'll look at my smoke detectors or fire extinguishers or whatever. In factories, they tend, if they're well run, to have a similarly sort of established hierarchy, which is, okay, something's gone wrong. I know that I got to talk to maintenance or I got to talk to the production supervisor, whatever. In our experience, knowledge work rarely has anything remotely resembling this. And so as a consequence, when a knowledge worker comes across a problem they don't know how to resolve, it's totally ambiguous what they're supposed to do. And I really want to emphasize here that as a consequence, because of the ambiguity, you're often fighting the psychology, right? Because I don't really know who I'm supposed to talk to, and I don't really want to tell my boss. And so I think to myself, well, I don't really want to talk about this problem. So maybe either I'll just let it slide, or maybe I'll try to sleep on it tonight and see if I can figure it out myself. But either of those basically has the impact of just allowing defects to go downstream and delaying the discovery of important issues. So having a clear design about who I'm supposed to ask help from, in our experience, can help a lot. And it does mean that there's going to be some hierarchy in the organization. Now, it's not so much a supervisory hierarchy, but it's a sort of problem-solving hierarchy. And you can also think about that as if I'm a salesperson and I'm out there and I discover that our customers are no longer buying our product because there's a new competitor. Well, I want to escalate that up the chain really quickly because that may have big strategic implications. And so wiring that information flow together is really critical to creating an organization that can adapt rapidly to changing conditions. Don, I stole your metaphor, but I don't know if you have other pieces.
Yeah, that's fine. And I think the word hierarchy is the wrong word because there's all kinds of emotional baggage with that, like I'm in charge, you do what I say, and blah, blah. We use the term structure. What we want to do is someone doing an individual job and they run across a problem. There should be boundaries on that problem to say, if this happens, you need to ask for help because it's about the work. It's not about you. And so do you know who to ask for help? And does that person know to respond right away to keep the work moving? And I think without those boundaries, all the kind of cultural biases in organization come into play, as Nelson was talking about, like I'm supposed to bring solutions. I'm not supposed to ask for help because I look dumb or I'll get yelled at. Instead of like, there's a problem in the work. It could be my fault. It could be supplier's fault. It could be anyone's fault. It doesn't matter right now. There's a fire and I want some response in order to keep the work moving. So that cultural piece fits well, but I think it's more the structure because it's not always to your boss that you would call for help. It might be to another department, someone that can help you. But the fact is, we want to put that structure in place so people know how to operate it. And the culture is to use it when the design says to use it and not hide problems. And that kind of takes the onus away from people who are like, oh, I don't want to be the only one always talking about our problems. No, the culture is you're punished for not highlighting problems and bringing them to light to get them solved. You're punished for hiding them. So we love the problems because, as I said before, it's kind of a crack in the wall to see where there's a weakness in the organization, some light's coming through. There's a chance for improvement and innovation if we go in and understand why that's happening. Now, if it happens to be my fault, okay, you can send me to HR later, but right now we need to go figure out and problem solve it.
That's prompted some questions, and Deborah had asked a little earlier that she noticed that organizations don't want to problem solve, and maybe that's just what you were talking about
exactly.
there.
Just do what I told you to do.
Yeah.
What don't you understand about 10% improvement? Go away.
So her question is, how do you convince organizations that implementing these kinds of principles actually can be good for them, for their job, and the organization as a whole?
I'll let the practitioner go first on this one.
My experience with trying to convince people and to sell people is very poor. So my experience is the best way is to demonstrate it. Demonstrate the success. And just like my boss at Harley, like I would go to him and say, hey, Jim McCaslin was his name. We have this problem with the cam manufacturing, and I'm going to make a 30% improvement in it. It was a huge quality issue. Everyone knew it. I'm going to make a 30% improvement that in the next 6 weeks, and I'll come back and give the results. He goes like, whatever, Don, go away. So 6 weeks later, I bring back this change and the huge improvement. And then I said, I'm going to do it again in another area. About the third time I delivered results to him, he goes, Don, who are you? What are you doing? So I think it's results in the business that people get, and to attack the way they think about the work or see the work or believe in the work is the wrong approach, the cultural approach. Get the behavior right, get people interested. The other nice thing about dynamic work design is when the work is organized correctly for humans, people actually like it because you remove the barriers to them actually doing the work they're trained to work, the work they love to do when they come into work. And so when it works better and puts points on the board, they start talking about it. Then you start getting people knocking on your door. Hey, Don, can you do that in my area? Can you come fix this? Then you've created a pull on the organization, and it's not pushing on some cultural norms.
Yeah, I would add two really quick things to that, which is number one, I think the way that particularly large organizations have started to think about change has just really gotten wrong-headed in the last, I don't know, certainly over the course of my career, which is we now tend to think of organizational change as this very painful episodic phenomena where every 18 to 24 months, we do this major reorganization, usually aided and abetted by an expensive consultant. And, we switch from matrix to function or function to business or whatever. Huge disruption to the organization. In the beginning, you don't really know who you report to, and you've got 3 lines connecting to you on the organization chart, and, your printers don't work anymore, and so on and so forth. And then just about the time you finally figure out who you report to and how to get your work done, what do? We do it again. And so what I think Don and I have really tried to get people to think about with dynamic work design is let's think of change as something that happens every day rather than every year or two, which is it's just a slow burn of small experiments. We're fixing the next problem. And it just turns out that has a lot of really desirable properties. I think it builds a lot of kind of general purpose fitness once you get people engaged in problem solving. And it creates a lot of additional adaptability. And then I think the final thing is it's just more fun to work that way, which is, I think one of the sort of underappreciated geniuses of the Toyota system is it changed the job description for highly repetitive work from doing the job to doing the job and discovering the next best way to doing that job. And I don't know, I'm not sure that it's going to make bolting wheels on a Toyota Camry as much fun as being a brain surgeon or something like that, but it's certainly more fun doing it that way than just having to be, doing what you're told. When I teach organizational behavior, I always tell my students, it's like, if you take nothing else away from all of this industrial psychology, the basic rule is people don't like to be told what to do, right? And if you can just absorb that as a leader, you're sort of well on your way to being successful.
And I think for me, this working in factories for 30 years, which is basically a game of whack-a-mole, just can come in every day and just hammer down the same old problems every day. They just show up in different ways. It changed that to a cross between a jigsaw puzzle, like where's the next piece? Can we find the corner pieces and the edge pieces and put these colors together and the picture emerges? And a board game, a cross between a jigsaw puzzle and a board game, which is like, it's not just hammering down the same old problems. We can actually create something different and new. And now we can see progress. And that gets people hooked because they're learning things, they're making progress, they're working together. Now life is exciting. It totally changes the workplace. And that's why people who do it successfully love it.
So building on some things we were just talking about there, John asked, how do you address the "I can solve it myself" bias, particularly of smart people? And maybe we can add a little bit to that. We hear all the time the idea that you get rewarded for bringing solutions, not problems, to your manager or to your management team, right? So how do you square that circle?
Yeah, so I think that's it's a great question, and I don't know how many bosses have said, don't bring me problems, bring me solutions, and I think it's a deeply pathological way to go about stuff because what it's doing is it's taking, and I think I mentioned this early it's taking all that creativity, which we want, right? We want people to solve problems in the organization, but it's driving it underground. And I think one of the things, just to open the aperture a little bit, that Don and I talk about all the time is when a supervisor and a subordinate have a conversation, a performance conversation, we strongly recommend that they talk about both the targets and the activities that are going to lead to that targets. In other words, that, Peter, I want to know a little bit about how you're going to go get that 17% that I'm going to ask you for. And there's a lot of psychology that underlies that I won't drag people through. But when those performance conversations are both about what I need you to do and how you're going to get there, then coaching opportunities emerge. Then we can start to have discussions about, is this the right activity set? And then the other thing is, back to our first principle, is when people are solving problems, we want that creativity. We just want it to be public, right? And we want to use a little bit of a structured method so that if someone invents a new good way of doing a job, everyone else can benefit from that. We have a little example in the book of one of our students who ran a couple casinos in Las Vegas, and he, for his class project, wanted to make the check-in process work better. Long story short, every check-in clerk had learned to do his or her job a little bit differently, and each one of them had one or two aspects of best practice that they had figured out themselves. Once they got them in a 15-minute meeting every day to talk about best practice, oh, great. Hey, Peter, you speak Spanish. Why don't you deal with this? Or, wow, what a great way to check in a tired customer. Now suddenly we're learning together rather than everybody developing their little sort of idiosyncratic way. So we do want people solving problems. We just want to raise it above the waterline so we can take advantage of all those good ideas.
I'll give two. I'm not sure if they're metaphors or similes or whatever. Nelson can tell you what it is, but it's like everyone wants to work on their own jigsaw puzzle. But the leader's got to say, no, we have one jigsaw puzzle and you have a piece of it. So that's above the waterline. We want to solve one puzzle. Everyone's got to be connected to it. I mean, just think of an orchestra. When they're tuning up, everyone's working really hard, but they're all playing their own music. And what's the result? It's just noise. I mean, they're all learning and tuning up. They're doing their own benefit. But what happens when the conductor taps on the board and says, we're going to play the same sheet of music and we're going to play it to the same cadence? Now it's beautiful music. And you notice that when they're playing, the violins are not always playing furiously. Sometimes they're quiet. So we want to get the system working and have everyone tied into that one version of the jigsaw puzzle in the board game, not off on their own. So of course we want individual creativity, but when you find something, just as Nelson said, it comes above the water. Is it a piece of the puzzle that we can fit in, make it clear for everyone? And that's the difference.
Great, thank you. That actually leads, if I may, combine two questions from Vishnu and Hughes. Vishnu is wondering about what your thoughts are about navigating these kinds of challenges when teams are spread across different offices, time zones, cultures. You mentioned sort of languages, Nelson, and I think Hughes has the other side of the coin of that. How do you do this in very large companies which actually do have these many levels of approvals? Often, if they're multinational companies, those can be extremely complicated decision-making processes. So how would you even get started?
Yeah, let me divide that into two pieces. I think number one is, global organizations, particularly big ones, finding time to have face-to-face communications to really connect the human chain is hard. right? There's just no getting around that. If you have people on 3 different continents, there's about 1 or 2 hours a day where you can have a meeting that, doesn't mean that one person at least has to meet at 3 or 4 in the morning, which is pretty painful. So I actually think that that puts an even bigger premium on designing the flow of the work, because those face-to-face connections are so scarce in that context. And this is a place where I think the world is different today than it was 50 years ago, where we were all in the same building in Detroit and I could walk down the hall and I could stick my head in Don's office, right? That's just a lot less available to us. Now, some people might think, well, I can just Slack Don or send him an IM, but trust me, that is not the same thing in terms of the quality of the communication. So I do think you have to design that very, very carefully. The second thing I would say, though, is when it comes to large organizations, you need to be very careful in making what we think is a sort of common leadership mistake, which is, if you're a leader in a big organization, you often think that the only way to move that organization is to do big things. And we actually dedicate the last chapter of the book to this sort of idea. You can still follow the approach that Don described. And in fact, I think we would recommend is pick a small problem, right? Where you see something going wrong, get involved in it, make progress, and start making change in concentric circles. And I know it will feel like in the beginning, like I work for a multi-billion-dollar organization. I'm working on this one thing and one tiny, like it's going to feel like you're working below your pay grade. But I think the fallacy in that is, number one, if you do start small, you learn an immense amount about how your organization works. And number two, there is nothing that propagates change, even in large organizations, like actually generating real successes.
Right.
We had a student a couple of years ago in one of our classes that works for a big semiconductor company, multi-billion dollars, made a really nice little change in a one development project, cut something from 4 months down to 1 month. Great success, one project. But it turns out that there was a similar project in their West Coast office, 3,000 miles away. And 2 weeks later, they got that part of the process done for their project even faster than him, even though that second project was not at all in his scope. How did that happen? Well, the informal information transmission network works very effectively. And everybody heard that, wow, Mike's project's going really well. They're trying this new stuff. We don't want to be left behind. So let's keep an eye on what they're doing, and then they make it even better. So I think the start small principle still applies. And again, I'll just warn you in advance, it takes some faith on your part as a leader to get your hands a little dirty again, but it tends to be a much more effective change method in the long run, rather than the t-shirts and the coffee mugs and the offsites and the stuff that we talked about earlier.
Yeah, I have a shorter answer. It depends. So if you've ever had a really good meeting, like could be during a crisis or particular issue, was like short, to the point, came out with a great solution, everyone worked together, they knew what to do, and they went out of the meeting. If you've ever had that, then you know what a good meeting and a good system looks like. So now you just follow the method. Like, how can I get closer to that? Even though it's a big organization, as Nelson said, I'm going to start small. Where's a particular place where this shows up? And I'm going to figure out how in this environment, be it big, small, remote, or local, how I can get closer to that using the principles of work design. And then it spreads. So I think it's about experimentation, knowing what you need to do, and then start running small scale experiments. And once, just as Nelson said, once you figure out, oh, look how we did this with this remote thing with Europe between Asia and Europe, it's like people will say, hey, that's a great idea. It's going to spread like wildfire. So there is no answer to how do I do it in a big organization without knowing that big organization, breaking it into specific problems that need to be solved and measured, making progress, and then growing that experience based on knowledge and demonstrated results.
Great, thank you. Getting a bit more into the weeds of practicality, Ramesh and John, and I'm sure many others are wondering about what does visualizing knowledge work actually look like? How do you recommend people do that? And surely there's a software application out there that you can just go and buy that will do all this for you.
There is no software application that you can buy that will do it for you, because this is about human communication. So when we're standing around together looking at the work on the wall, not just the metrics, can we actually show where the work is being done, who's doing it, what the state of the work is? When we all see the same thing and then we can talk about it, then that's an effective visual representation. But the key is not the drawing on the wall, what kind of shape it is, or the software, but can we get it clear enough that we can talk together and figure out what to do next? That human conversation is the magic. There is one that's pretty good that we use called Miro, M-I-R-O, but there's one on Zoom. But the trick is, don't just put the results, the metrics up. Where is the work? If you have 15 projects, can you show the projects on the wall in what stage they're on, when they're moving, what the issues are, so everyone can see the traffic jam, the bottlenecks, the problems, and then you decide together what you're going to do about it. That's really where the magic is. Nelson?
Yeah, I would, I don't have that much else to say other than I think number one, the metaphor here that you want to think about for visual management is not a scorecard, right? Lots of people have scorecards with metrics and stuff. Think of it as a radar screen, right? So your air traffic controllers sit there, they can see where all the planes are, they can spot congestion. I mean, hopefully there's no congestion, but they could spot emerging congestion, right? What you want is to know where that knowledge work is and where it's moving. How you do that, there's a bunch of different ways. Prior to COVID, Don and I were very enamored with as low tech as you can get, which was Post-its and markers and whiteboards. We realized in the remote world, that's not always feasible. There's a bunch of different digital tools out there. Miro, if you want to start really simple, most of you are probably familiar with Trello, which you can learn to use in about 30 seconds. But I think the big thing to take away, and let me just re-emphasize something Don said, the magic is not the representation. The magic is the conversations that you and your team have in front of the board. If you're having good conversations that are surfacing problems and helping you allocate your scarce attention in the right direction, you're probably doing it right. The risk is that once you have it digitized, someone will say, oh, hey, Peter, I'm awful busy today. I can't make the meeting, but I'll check the board when I get home at night. The moment that happens, the magic is lost, right? Because it's that face-to-face conversation that the board catalyzes and facilitates. So, when in doubt, start simple and really have it drive the meeting rather than get fancy about, how the boxes and the arrows and stuff like that.
Hey, let me respond quickly to James Hardy on the notes. He says, I bought the book and the workbook. There is no workbook from us. Someone probably, we haven't seen it yet, but probably someone went into dumped the book into AI and said, give me a workbook. So it may be right, it may be wrong, James. I don't know, but be careful. And the other thing he says is, this reminds me of what used to be done with HP Visual Factory, which is exactly right, because we started modeling where the physical work was in the factory on like a radar screen, as Nelson said, and then we could get a lot more knowledgeable about where the problems were. The trick with intellectual work is, what is the work? How do we represent the work on the wall? Is it a decision? Is it projects? Is it calls? What is the work that we're doing, and can we represent it on the wall? Once you get past that, then all the tips and tricks that people have used in physical manufacturing all of a sudden come back into focus with a new kind of twist to it. But making that leap is tough for someone. Well, I don't work in a factory. You don't need to work in a factory. You just need to be able to decide what your work is and can you represent it on the wall. If you're an executive, well, I just walk around and talk to people all day. Wrong. What is it you're delivering to the customer? Where is that work sitting? What's the work people are doing? That's the tough part, which takes experience and a little bit of experience to be able to see, like invoices. We can represent where invoices are. Now, are they flowing or not? We can represent where audits are, where projects are. Any kind of intellectual work, we can represent where's the research? What stage is it in? Is it in whatever? Anyway, that's really the trick to this, to people who have experience with these other methods, is how can I make a visual representation of the work that we're doing in the office area?
It also sounds from that what you found is that it's very particular to the circumstances and the organization and the business and their own language and how they think about the work themselves. Exactly. Very difficult, therefore, to your earlier comment about workbooks, perhaps to do a one-size-fits-all kind of just follow this recipe approach. Yeah,
I remember so many times. I'll just tell one instance of our tax accountant who came to me. It was a personal friend of mine, and we'd go out to dinner, and he'd ask me about the work because he was doing our books, and I'd tell him kind of what was going on. And one year he said, Don, I've had the worst tax season in my life. Can you come in and help me? I went in one day. I know nothing about tax accounting, but I showed where all the maps, where all the tax returns were, while they were built up, why they weren't moving, and showed him in this little hand-drawn drawing, which at the end of the day, this guy, Peter, grew up in this business. It was his father's business. He'd been working there since he was a teenager, and he's my age, which I don't want to say what it is, but it's not in the 60s anymore. He said, Don, is that what we do? But they just couldn't, they'd never visualized or had the flow of the work. They thought always in these static structures of the bosses and the workers and the accounting, but they never really took the view of the organization from the view of a piece of work moving through it as it moves from person to person. And that was an eye opener, even for this guy who'd been in the business 50, 60 years.
I think that's a very profound insight and the visualization of all your work here. So thank you very much. Thank you both for spending this time with us and sharing your latest work and the book with us. I can thoroughly recommend that everyone should go out and get hold of a copy of the book itself, not the workbook. And if you are interested in learning more directly from Nelson and Don, taking fully to heart what they both shared about the value of getting together live, whether that's in a physical room or in a sort of a Zoom or virtual room like this, then they have several versions of executive education courses. We're showing them on the screen at the moment, but please do come by the executive education website, executive.mit.edu, and look up Don and Nelson, and you can see all the teaching that they do for us in executive education. And I'm sure they would be thrilled to see some of you face to face or screen to screen in some future course to help you learn about and adopt these kinds of principles. Once again, thank you, Don, Nelson. I know you're extremely busy on the book tour, so we really appreciate you spending time to talk to our community and look forward to following up again more. There were more questions we didn't have a chance to get to, so I'm sure we'll be able to do a repeat in maybe a few months' time when we can see what else you've learned from the reactions that you're getting to the books, the book as the word is getting out about this very important work. Thank you again. Thank you, Charlotte and the exec ed team. And more importantly, thank you everyone out there for giving us an hour of your time and sharing your thoughts and ideas with us too.
Thank you, Peter. Thank you, team. And thanks for everyone for attending.